So this is a quick walkthrough of what happened in Tigray since November 2020, the efforts made for justice and where we actually are now. Because what's happening now with the transitional justice policy has huge implications. So in terms of where it started, in November 2020, while the whole world was glued to the US elections, war broke out in Tigray. The Ethiopian Federal Forces, backed by Eritrean troops and Amhara regional militia, launched a full assault on Tigray. And instantly, Tigray was blacked out. No internet, no banks, no humanitarian access. And that siege lasted almost 2 years, more than 2 years. And in the time, what unfolded was extrajudicial killings, deliberate starvation, mass displacement, industrial scale sexual violence. And because the world wasn't watching, at least at first, the war was fought in almost total darkness. There was a first attempt at justice, and that came in 2021 when the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Office conducted a joint investigation into the Tigray conflict. While this initiative was presented as a step towards accountability, it faced significant criticism regarding its impartiality and depth. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, being a state-affiliated body, raised concerns about its independence and especially given its close ties with the Ethiopian government. Critics argued that the investigation disproportionately highlighted violations committed by the Tigray Defense Forces while downplaying or omitting atrocities done by the Ethiopian Federal Forces and their allies. Notably, the report failed comprehensively address well-documented massacres and instances of ethnic cleansing and starvation used as a weapon of war. Furthermore, the investigation limited the access to the regions, and because they needed the government's cooperation, they weren't able to comprehensively investigate anything. So collectively, many stakeholders called for a more independent and thorough investigation into the atrocities committed during the conflict. And so by the end of 2021, the consensus amongst the stakeholders was clear that a more robust and impartial victim-centered approach was necessary to ensure genuine accountability and justice for the victims of the Tigray conflict. So that was when the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia was born. In response to the mounting concerns over the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission investigation, Tigrayan diaspora and many others advocated for a truly independent inquiry, and the collective effort was what brought ICRI by the UN Human Rights Council in December 2021. ICRI was mandated to investigate violations of international human rights, humanitarian and refugee law committed since November the 3rd, 2020, against all parties of the conflict. Despite significant obstacles by the Ethiopian government, ICRI still investigated and published significant reports, and these reports documented widespread killings, at least 49 massacre sites, systemic sexual violence with thousands of Tigrayans being raped, forced displacement, arbitrary detention, and so on. ICRI conducted that there was reasonable grounds to believe that war crimes and crimes against humanity had been committed primarily by Ethiopian Federal Forces, Eritrean troops, and allied militia. For many victims, ICRI represented a beacon of hope and a sign the international community was acknowledging their suffering and seeking accountability. ICRI was, of course, not something that the Ethiopian government wanted. The government lobbied and made great efforts to ensure that the commission was crippled and did not have any access to do their investigations. They did everything in their power to ensure the end of its mandate. Fast forward onto November 2022, on the 2nd, the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front signed what's known as the Pretoria Agreement. So on paper, this was a landmark accord to end the brutal 2-year war, and it included significant promises. it says that it would end any violations of human rights, restore federal authority in Tigray, disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate the TPLF combatants, ensure unhindered humanitarian access. And the agreement reaffirms the need for a constitutional solution and mandates the withdrawal of non-Ethiopian National Defense forces from occupied areas. This agreement also included an implementation of a transitional justice policy, but the agreement had flaws. First, Eritrea and other militia groups, but specifically Eritrea, a key participant in the conflict and accused of some of the worst human rights violations, wasn't even part of the deal. Second, the agreement lacked any concrete mechanisms for justice or accountability for the victims. And third, there was no clear roadmap for how transitional justice would actually happen. It was just vague intentions and political language. Then came a critical turning point following the cessation of hostilities agreement in 2023. Ethiopian government presented its own transitional justice policy green paper draft that was supposed to take into consideration the thoughts of victims and stakeholders and be inclusive and so on. This agreement was later approved by the House of People's Representatives and then by the Council of Ministers again, where there were no Tigrayan representatives at all. This policy was used to shut down ICRI. So from the beginning, the process wasn't just flawed, it was actually weaponized. It was used not to seek truth and justice, but to silence truth. As well as being weaponized, it is also being implemented by the government that perpetrated these crimes. And while transitional justice, the transitional justice policy on paper sounds good, mentioning prosecutions, truth-seeking, reparations, reforms, and so on, the reality that it tells is a completely different story. First, victims are not at the center of the process. There is no real guarantee that survivors will be meaningfully involved in shaping what transitional justice, what justice in general looks like. Second, the language of the policy is very vague and confusing. Some of the most serious crimes, like conflict-related sexual violence, may be diverted into truth-telling mechanisms instead of courts of law. And this really completely undermines the gravity of these crimes and what they have inflicted on the victims. Third, the policy does not even acknowledge the crimes committed by Eritrean forces. It skips over them entirely as if Eritrean troops did nothing and were not involved in the conflict. And finally, the document is alarmingly thin on implementation. There's no timeline for prosecutions, there's no safeguards or independence, no dedicated budget or protection for witnesses, and so on. All of this is happening while violence continues across Ethiopia. There is conflict in Amhara, conflict in Oromia, and Tigray still has displaced populations, and parts of it remain under Eritrean occupation, but also under the occupation of Fano militia groups, which are aligned with the federal government. And this transitional justice framework does not address any of that. Let's be honest, it's not about justice. It's a compliance exercise designed to tick boxes for the international community and shut down any independent and international oversight. And for international actors, this is a moment of decision. We can either hold this process to real standards, or we can allow the Ethiopian government to control the narrative, to continue other conflicts and bury the truth and deny survivors the justice that they deserve. But without real justice, there can be no real reconciliation, no sustainable peace. At this point, we are working to center victims and to work with victims to ensure that their voices are heard while this process is carried out by the government that perpetrated these crimes. We want to push for independent investigations into the past and ongoing violations. All crimes must be investigated, including those committed by Eritrean and Ethiopian forces and also militia groups. The perpetrators cannot lead the justice process. That's not justice, that's impunity. Second, justice for sexual violence survivors is extremely important. They're not just tragic stories, these are crimes, and they must be prosecuted, not pushed into vague truth-telling forums. We also need concrete guarantees and protection for witnesses, independence of all investigative and judicial bodies, a clear and enforceable timeline for prosecutions, and a transparent, properly resounding budget. And 5, there needs to be an acknowledgement that there is ongoing violations. There needs to be an end to the ongoing conflict across the region, including the violent occupation in Tigray, across Ethiopia, like the Amhara region and the Oromia region too. This is what we're dealing with, and the efforts here would be to sensitize victim groups in civil society so they themselves are equipped to respond to this process.